As you can see, the economy has worn me down. Five years ago, I was 6'1". My real concern, actually, is not the economy. I'm going to come back to the economy very quickly, but my real concern is politics. I think that's really the crisis we are in. It's not an economic crisis. It's much more of a political crisis. Politics, the word politics comes from the Greek root poly, meaning many, and ticks, small blood-sucking insects. No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that. Cory Mayer, Cory Booker, I don't mean that. My heart goes out to people who are dedicated and have dedicated their lives to politics. I agree with Eric. Their time horizons are entirely different, and all of us, whether in politics or innovators or in the private sector or in academia, have got to think about the long-term future. I couldn't help, though, Eric, as you were talking, remembering something that John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist, said, and that is, in the long term, we're all dead. So we have to kind of put some boundaries, but in the long term, we have children and their children and other children. I want to raise, in terms of this conference, I want to raise a question, not so much about thinking about the future, although that is critical. The question I want to raise in terms of the theme of the conference is who is us? Economists and policy analysts look at what is happening in the United States and the world, and there is an extraordinary amount of agreement. I mean, you wouldn't know it by looking at television, because most of the time, the debates on television, the media in this country, you have two people who are debating, and the idea is the truth lies somewhere between the reasonable and the wacky. But actually, there is a great deal of consensus, remarkable consensus on what has to be done. Number one, we have a crisis in aggregate demand. That is, consumers in the United States, their spending is 70% of the economy. Consumers now, for all sorts of good reasons, are holding back. They are worried. They still have a huge debt load. They went through the housing crisis. $7.7 trillion of housing values have been lost. And consumers are in no mood to buy. And businesses are not going to hire if consumers are not buying. This is not rocket science. This is simply a vicious cycle. And most analysts and most kind of economists understand that you've got to have, in this kind of circumstance, an expansionary monetary policy and an expansionary fiscal policy. And when it comes to Europe, most people, even economists in Europe I talk with all the time, say austerity is not the right remedy right now. Austerity might be important in the future. In fact, you've got to get everybody's books and bank balance sheets fine and straight. But right this minute, austerity is actually the wrong remedy, because it means more and more people out of work. It means fewer revenues into government. It means social unrest. It means all sorts of things you don't want right now. Economists also understand that in this country, the budget deficit is an important issue, but right now you want growth and you want jobs for exactly the same reason. Because if you've got growth and jobs, you've got more government revenues. If you've got growth, then the ratio of the debt to the GDP, and that's what we're really talking about, the ratio of debt to total economy, starts going down over the future. If you don't have any growth, if you don't have jobs, then you are in huge problem, because that debt-GDP ratio keeps on getting higher and higher and higher. And what most economists also understand is that in the future, at least in the United States, the big driver of the debt is healthcare costs. We're going to talk about that later this morning, but healthcare costs in the United States are rising too fast. We can't deal with it. And when you combine that with 76 million baby boomers whose bodies over the next 20 years are all going to be corroding together, you've got a huge budget problem. And the budget problem is not Medicare per se, it's the costs underlying Medicare and Medicaid, and they are going to bankrupt all of us if we don't do something about it. So again, there's a great deal of consensus on all of this. Why is it so difficult for us to take action? And here is why, and here is where I want to talk about the issue of us. Because an economy and politics are not matters of dollar flows. I mean, we tend, if we read the financial pages of the newspaper, we tend to think about finance. No, it's people. And it's how people define us, that is the community of concern, that determines what we mean by an economy and what we mean by a society. Margaret Thatcher once famously said, there's no such word because there's no such idea, there's no such thing as a society. I respectfully disagree. I think there is a society, and a society or a community is defined by two things. Number one, empathy, that is who we feel empathic with, who we identify with, and number two, who we are mutually interdependent upon. That is, empathy and interdependence are what we define as a community. Let me give you some examples. Right now, in the United States, we've got 9.1% unemployment. We've got 25 million people who are looking for full-time work, 17 million who have no work at all. Now, under normal circumstances, if that's all you knew about America, you'd say this is a huge crisis, and everybody, every politician, every innovator would be working on how to overcome this crisis. But when you think harder about it, and when you look at the data more specifically, you realize that among people who are college graduates, the unemployment rate is only 5%. If you only have a high school degree, the unemployment rate is closer to 15 or 16%. If you're a high school dropout, the unemployment rate is between 30 and 40%. So who is us? Who do we define in our community of concern? Could it be that because most of us, and I dare say most of us in this room, are college graduates, even though college graduates in the United States are about 35% of total adult population, could it be that because college graduates talk to each other, because all we know are college graduates, we don't quite have the urgency about unemployment that we might have if it affected more of us and our children and our friends and associates? Or to take another very close example, with regard to incomes, we know that incomes are going up on average. If you look into the data we have about average incomes, they're going up, but averages are tricky. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'1". You see, averages are tricky because they bring up, the top brings up the average. If you look at the median, however, you see that median, that is half above, half below, the median wage is actually dropping and continuing to drop. When I talk to CEOs about the big problems they have, all the time they tell me, recruiting and retaining talent. That is my number one objective, because I understand that my barrier to entry essentially comes down to innovation, my brand, and my talent. But more and more of the workforce in the United States and in other countries is not deemed talent. It's deemed a cost of production. And so while the talent is doing better and better, people who are well-educated, who can recognize and solve new problems, who are very creative, they're doing better and better. The median wage is actually dropping, and the median wage is dropping because not only are we having a big employment problem, but even those who are employed, most of them are the costs of doing business, and to be successful, most companies have got to get those costs down. Not talent. You want talent up, you want the cost down. Or to give you another example, American competitiveness. We talk about competitiveness, national competitiveness. Some of you are not from the United States. National competitiveness. It's one of those terms to have gone directly from obscurity to meaninglessness without any intervening period of coherence. Some people, when they talk about national competitiveness or American competitiveness, they're talking about the market share, world market share, or the sales of American-based companies or national-based companies. And that is indeed one way of talking about American or national competitiveness. But that's not the only way. If your community of concern is slightly differently, you might say, I don't really care about how companies do who happen to be headquartered in the United States. I care about jobs and wages in the United States, and that has much more to do with net exports from the United States or whatever country you're talking about. And as big companies become more and more global in terms of sales and also investors, marketing, talent, there is less and less overlap between doing well as a big company and doing well as a nation. Again, who is us? What is our community of concern? Or finally, to take one last example, I was looking at the data recently, and I follow poverty data in the United States and in other countries pretty carefully, and I was interested to see that we have had a huge success in the United States in one respect. If you are a senior, poverty is now down to 5.7% of people who are over 65. That is a huge, huge gain. 50 years ago, over 25% of people who were over 65 years old were in poverty as we define poverty. So that's a huge success. But if you look at children in the United States, you see something very different. Right now, 37% of families with young children in the United States are in poverty. That is the highest rate of child poverty we have had in America since data started to be collected on poverty in 1962. And how can it be that we've got a huge success with regard to the elderly, and yet a huge problem with regard to children? And why aren't we talking about this? Well, could it be that our community of concern, given that so many of us are baby boomers or about to become retired or thinking in terms of retirement and thinking in terms of Medicare and Social Security, those are the big fights in Congress. You don't hear much fighting over programs for children and for families with young children. Could it be that our orientation, our community of concern, is very much oriented in one direction and not in another? My whole point is that the most important words in politics and in economics are the personal pronouns. Us, we, our, O-U-R, and by implication, them, they, and their. These personal pronouns define our communities of concern. They define who we are all about, who we are interdependent with, who we empathize with. I was down at the Google campus a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned this to Eric. And I was talking to people there about California. California's education system used to be the best in the world. It's now one of the worst in the United States. And I'm talking about K through 12, but now it's starting to affect higher education. California used to have the best system of higher education in the entire world, public higher education. And now it is slipping dramatically because of all of the budget cuts. And because people really, in terms of higher education and even K through 12, have not done enough to think about and change the way education is delivered. Well, the net result of all of that is that although California is the center of high technology, in many respects, center of high technology in the world, and California is the center of venture capital in the world, and California is the center of entertainment in the world. Nevertheless, California in terms of its educational infrastructure, is slipping almost to last place in America. How can that be? Well, the answer is that a lot of the talent in terms of high technology and venture capital and also entertainment is coming from all over the world. It's not dependent, interdependent. It's not dependent on California geographically any longer. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. It's good that the United States and indeed these centers of innovation are drawing from the entire world. That's great. We are interdependent in terms of the entire world. Our community of concern goes beyond California, goes beyond the United States. That's wonderful. The problem is that because there is less dependence on California, just to take that one example, there is less political motivation to do anything about the crisis of education there. And so this issue of empathy and interdependence becomes very important in terms of our futures, O-U-R, futures. One final point. The history of civilization has been toward a larger and larger view of who is us. 1,000 years ago, it was the tribe. 500 years ago, it began to be the beginnings of a nation. 200 years ago, it was a nation. And then nations started to come together. Right now, Europe is trying to decide whether Greece is part of us or is them. And that is the central political dialogue that's going on in the Eurozone right now. But as we come together, beware the regressive forces that want to say they are different. They are not us. As economic stresses increase here in the United States and around the world, you hear more and more people who are stressed, who say effectively, they're not me, those immigrants, I don't want to pay for them. I don't want to pay for their children going to my universities. Those poor, they're not me, they're not like me. I don't want to pay for them. The regressive forces that want to define who is us in a smaller and smaller way become more dominant when people are under great economic stress. And so, what I want to leave you with is a challenge. Google has paved the way for expanding our sense of us and empowering more and more people around the world to actually be innovators. That seems to me to be one of the most essential routes to expanding the notion of us, both in terms of empathy and also in terms of interdependence. The question we should all be asking ourselves is, what can we be doing over the next years to continue to expand that notion and to face the regressive forces that have a very pinched and smaller view of the pronoun us? Thank you very much.